sponsored in part by Decolonizing Wealth, Liberated Capital, and Black Lives Matter Grassroots. In this episode of the Trahern Crews Show, we take a look at the Reparations Summit in North Minneapolis. The event was sponsored and organized by Black Lives Matter Minnesota in collaboration with the Council for Minnesotans on African Heritage. The purpose of the event is to educate community members about the Minnesota Migration Act, which establishes reparations for the American Descendants of U.S. Chattel Slavery who reside in the state of Minnesota.
And what are some of the opportunities in order to create real impact. So I just want to thank all of the partners and those who made sure that this summit could occur. So can we give the partners and everyone responsible for the summit a hand, please? So I think that's all important. Last 30 members, as I've been.
Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Sing a song full of the faith that the darkness has taught us, and sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought. And sing the rising sun of our new day begun, and let us march on till victory is won. Stormy the road we've trod, fear that chastening rod, felt in the days when hope unborn has died, yet with a steady beat have not our weary feet come to a place for which our Father sighed. For we have come over a way that with tears has been watered, and we have come treading our path through the blood of the So we stand and let where like we you take us out of the past. God will you've been the last time lost here. Thou who hast brought us far wrong. Thou who hast by might, you led us into reality. Keep us forever in your path, we pray. Let our feet stray from the places, our God, where we met thee, and let our hearts drunk with the wine of this world we forget thee. The shadow beneath thine hand, and may we forever stand true to our God, and
And then we're going to open it up for questions to ask our panel. What we are asking when we open this panel discussion up about reparations and Reparation Act, we need it to be very respectful. I know everyone's coming in this venue with their own agenda, but the main agenda is learning about reparations and how we can support the Reparation Act. So please, when you address our panel guests, we are asking you to address them with a specific question that you would like to know, or what you can do to help this bill move into action. So now I'm going to turn it back over to my queen. There you go, queen. Welcome back, welcome back.
I think the mic is caught up. Okay, there it goes. Yep, it just came back on. Sorry about that. Welcome back. So our next guest is going to be Representative Hussein. Is she here? Are you here? Yep. So if you could give him a round of applause.
Well, hello. I say I can't hear you. Hello. You gotta speak up. Come on, y'all. I'm very, very excited to be here with you all. My name is State Representative Sammakab Hussein from Rando, 65A. Yeah. And I've been carrying the bill for the last 2 years. The state of Minnesota. You know, I'm not shy about it. You know, and I'm very proud of it. That I want to carry this bill, and I want to make sure that this gets to the end of it, because the racial, social, economic disparity that we see in our state is real, and we need to address that. And I'm not going to shy about it. As a Rando kid, I grew up in 65, Aurora Avenue, 6995, and it takes a village for us to address this matter. I've seen what my brothers and sisters and our family go through when 94 came through. I did study a little bit more. When African American came to resettle in the state of Minnesota, that is, we settled for Rando. They settled in the heart of the downtown Minneapolis, downtown St. Paul on 7th Street. That's where they came, all of them, and stayed until they shift all the way to the Rando community in the state history. I had to dig a little bit more for a couple hundred years ago. And those community was doing very, very well. They were like, their barbershops, they had their business going, they had like groceries, they had like everything that you name it. But as a racial discriminations, which is the state of Minnesota, still exists, and we're trying to fight against it as a state legislator. We're trying to address that, and we're not shying about it. We're saying this is enough. We want to make sure that everybody have opportunity to live peace, to raise their child, to have economic wealth. Every community, regardless where you come from, regardless who you are, regardless who you look like. But those community that from north side all the way to Rando had difficult challenges when 94 and 35 come through. So when we put together, Trahern, my brother right here, you know, we appreciate it for you coming out always. We drafted the bill together for, the bill came from him and the community.
All right, next up we have welcome remarks led by a representative from the Council for Minnesotans of African Heritage, Mr. Rose. Followed by Trahern Crews, leader of Black Lives Matter Minnesota.
right, thank you all. Good evening, everyone. Yes, it's so good to be with you all. My name is Theo Rose. I am Policy Director for the Council for Minnesota of African Heritage, or SEMA. So on behalf of SEMA and our board, just want to welcome you all to Exploring Reparations for Economic Equity, the focus on the Minnesota Migration Act. Just want to thank you all for being here this evening. We're very happy to see this full room. I know we already did a round of applause for everybody being here. I want us to do it again because I'm very happy to see you all here. Yeah, so I want to just on a high level, we are co-hosting, partnering with Black Lives Matter Minnesota for this program. We want to thank BLM Minnesota for their partnership in putting this together. Our communities are working very hard to find solutions to very, very difficult economic and social challenges, as we all know in this room.
They also have been paid to our Native American brothers and sisters, and other groups too. Reparations are payments, monetary or otherwise, given to a group that has suffered harm. They are not foreign to the United States, as Native Americans have received land and billions of dollars of various benefits and programs for being forcibly exiled from their native lands. For Japanese Americans, received $1.5 billion was paid to those who were interned during World War II. And via the Marshall Plan, the United States helped ensure that Jews received reparations for the Holocaust. For in 1952, West Germany agreed to pay 3.45 billion Dutch marks to Holocaust survivors. A lot of people say, well, there was never slavery in Minnesota. So one of our guest speaker, our keynote speaker, will address that. But even just recently in St. Paul, we just found out that there was a black community as early as the 1830s on the West 7th area in St. Paul. And so in St. Paul, we do have a reparations commission. On January 13th, the St. Paul City Council passed Resolution 2177 that apologized for holding Dred Scott military slavery at Fort Snelling. It apologized for the destruction of the Rondo community via the I-94 freeway, and apologized for St. Paul's discrimination against its black residents, and it set up a limited term legislative advisory committee that will make sure that created the permanent reparations ordinance. So St. Paul's commission is a permanent reparations commission, is now part of our government. And tomorrow, God willing, the city council will pass its budget, which includes a budget for our reparations commission, which we have been wanting for about a year and a half now. So we're really excited about that. And we won't clap now, but when they do pass that, we're going to give them a big round of applause. When they pass that, we'll do that. So that's why we're here. The Minnesota Migration Act, I think others will cover it too, but it does address what happened to Dred Scott, but it also addresses the Duluth lynching and calls for anti-lynching legislation at the state level, or anti-black policies at the state level. It also addresses police brutality here in Minnesota. So like we know, Minneapolis has a consent decree, and the consent decree alone makes the case for reparations. The Minneapolis consent decree, which we think could be a step, speaks for St. Paul, speaks for Duluth, not just Minneapolis, because they all get the same training, but it said Minneapolis, the city of Minneapolis, discriminates against its black residents and people with disabilities. We think a lot of the other municipalities do the same. It says it uses excessive force against its black residents. This isn't me saying this. This is the Department of Justice saying this, and Mayor Garland. And it talked about takedowns and unlawful killings. And that has been going on before George Floyd. That has been going on for a very long time. Also, Ramsey County did an anti-racism audit, and it said that its policies and procedures harm the people that society fears the most, and the people that society fears the most look like all the beautiful people in this room. So we really want your support with the Minnesota Migration Act. We've heard a lot of feedback from people. We encourage you to look at it. We're not ashamed of it. It's House File 2397. It's been tested on Black Twitter, and you know how Black Twitter is, so they poke holes in it, and they said this is a model for the federal government. So we think our community should definitely get behind this piece of legislation. So thank you. I'm not going to keep you going. We got a lot more speakers to get to, and thank you all for coming out to address the most important issue in American history today. Peace. So we have Professor Lehman. You ready? So we have Professor Lehman is a professor from St. Cloud University. He wrote a really key, important book called Slavery's Reach, and it details slavery and money from slavery that made its way to Minnesota. He's going to tell you more about it and how you can purchase that book, and he has a new book out too that's very important. So please give him a big round of applause. Let's welcome Professor Lehman to the podium.
Preconceived notions about Minnesota other than it being a state in the north, and based on what my education had led me to believe, there was not a significant presence of slavery here. But I only had to open one book in St. Cloud to tell me that that wasn't true, because that book said that there was this family, the Lowry family, that came from the south to live in central Minnesota, and they brought enslaved people with them. And those people stayed in central Minnesota for years. So they got my attention, and I wanted to make sure that that wasn't a fluke, so I started looking at census records. And census records showed that there were people who were unofficially enslaved people, but they were recorded as free because Minnesota was a free state in 1860, so there wasn't a separate slave schedule for enslaved people like there were for slave states back then. But what I wanted to do was to go to the next step and find a paper trail that had to do with money. And I knew that because Minnesota was established as a state in 1858, and the 13th Amendment ended legal slavery, except for incarceration, in 1865. That meant that for 7 years, Minnesota was part of the United States when slavery was legal in the country. So I figured that if anybody from the South, from a slave state, came to Minnesota and purchased any land or made any kind of financial investment in Minnesota, some of those Southerners might have been slaveholders. So a light bulb went off in my head that real estate agreements would be the paper trail. So I started going to different counties that were along the Mississippi River, because towns that were on the Mississippi River were the towns that got a lot of money from Southern tourists. So I started with my own county, Stearns County, which is where St. Cloud is, and I just thumbed through all these heavy volumes. I didn't do anything digital. I just went page by page, starting with the first deed in 1855, then going to 1865 to see how many people from the South were listed in the deeds. And every time I found someone listed in the South, I wrote their name down, wrote what county, what state they were from. And then when I went home that night, I would go to a database that would have the slave schedules from 1860 and 1850. And I would cross-reference to see if any of the people who were listed as buyers of land in Minnesota were also on these slave schedules as enslavers or slaveholders. And whenever I found a match, that deed was part of that paper trail. That deed was the proof that money from a plantation of enslaved African Americans exchanged hands from a slaveholder to a Minnesotan. And as soon as I had enough evidence of there being a substantial number of people doing that for different counties, then I started to look at where the money went in Minnesota. And certainly in St. Cloud, it went to the first mayor, Sylvanus Lowry. And he himself was not a slaveholder, but his father was. He had been part of Cumberland University and Cumberland Presbyterian Church. And he invited his father's wealthy friends from the South to come to St. Cloud and buy land from him. And there was one person who was actually commissioned to buy land on behalf of Cumberland University in Tennessee. But instead, he took that money and put the land in his own name. And when the university found out, they sued him, and they won. But they just had someone in St. Cloud sell the land to somebody else. Because by then, the Civil War was over, and Tennessee was in ruins. Cumberland University needed the money really badly. But Cumberland University owning land in St. Cloud was, I think, 5 years before St. Cloud State was established. So I like to say that St. Cloud had a university before St. Cloud State University. Now, when it comes to the Twin Cities, there are a lot more avenues to look at, especially literal ones, because one of the first things I was able to find in the Twin Cities was that there were two people who were actually very distantly related. William Hall and Harlan Eichelhart. Harlan Eichelhart came from Maryland at the invitation of the governor at the time, Willis Gordon, to come to Minnesota and make their way as young people in their 20s. Even though they held slaves in Maryland, they didn't want to bring them to Minnesota, but they had people hold the slaves for them in Maryland. So they were active slaveholders when they invested in land in St. Paul. So if you're familiar with the Payne-Fallon neighborhood in St. Paul, and you drive by those streets that have names of southern flowers like hyacinth, magnolia, jessamine. And if you go down Eichelhart Avenue, Maryland Avenue, those are all streets. That whole neighborhood was developed by these slaveholders. So money from slavery went into the development of that particular neighborhood. And we certainly have the deeds to prove it, and we have the names of the streets to prove it as well. Perhaps the most controversial thing that I found was evidence of a loan that someone from South Carolina made. So there was this man named Henry Rice. He was a delegate to Congress back when Minnesota was a territory. And when you had a territory instead of a state, someone who represented that place in Congress didn't have the power to vote on any bills, but they could still be there to at least comment on the legislation as it was being deliberated. So Henry Rice was a delegate for Minnesota Territory. But still, since he was in Congress, he had access to all his fellow congressmen who were from the South and who were very wealthy. And so he would invite them from time to time to Minnesota to invest in land. And there are places that are bearing the names of some of those people, like if you've ever heard of Breckinridge, that's named after John Breckinridge, who later became the vice president and was later involved with the Confederacy, but he was a good acquaintance of Henry Rice. But my controversial find was when Henry Rice invited William Aiken, who enslaved over 800 people in South Carolina on one plantation. He invited Aiken to come to Minnesota in the summer of 1856. And while Aiken was here, he happened to come across this shuttered building. It had been closed for about 2 years. It was the U of M. The University of Minnesota had opened in 1851. It closed in 1854. Aiken saw it, felt sorry for it, and decided to loan $15,000 on the spot, which is roughly $250,000 in today's money. But if you're owning 800 people and they're generating all this wealth through their labor, you have that kind of money to loan. So he loaned the money in 1856. And he cashed out half the loan the following year, but that still left $8,000 for the university to work with. The U of M actually reopened in 1858, thanks in part to that loan, but then they burned through the money quickly and shut down again before the end of the year. But they still owe Aiken. And they continued to owe Aiken for years. And then the Civil War broke out, and the Minnesota legislature had a problem. Now Aiken lives in a Confederate state, part of enemy country. So how can we, as Minnesota, not owe a Confederate anymore? So they passed the Minnesota Rebellion Act of 1862, and that law says that if anyone who lived in a Confederate state wanted to come to Minnesota and sue in its courts, they can't. So there was no way for Aiken to get his money back, and he never did. So the state of Minnesota just kept that money. And one of the nice things about looking at documents from when the events were taking place is that they often said the quiet parts out loud, because they figured, well, who else is going to read this? So I found Board of Regents reports from the middle of the war in 1863, right after the Rebellion Act. And the report clearly states that $8,000 was owed to Aiken before the present rebellion, which is to imply that now that we're in the rebellion, it's our money now. So that was good that at least the people back then had a vision to corroborate the evidence and the research that I would have over a century and a half later. So what are some things that people can do? What are some things that officials can do? Well, I'm glad to say that even in St. Cloud, Minnesota, there have been some steps that have been taken over the past few years. Without any kind of initiation from me, the outgoing mayor, Dave Kleiss, named a new park. Well, it was new back in 2017, but he named it after a couple of enslaved people I had found who had been kept in captivity in Minnesota, in St. Cloud specifically. The people were Mary Butler and her baby John, and so the park is called Butler Park. When I visited New Orleans about a couple of years ago, I noticed that there were several buildings that had landmarks or signage that said that slavery was here, or that an enslaver lived there, or an enslaver owned that building. And I think that kind of signage would be good for places here in Minnesota, so that there can be a way for the state to recognize that, whether it's the Payne-Phelan neighborhood, or whether it's neighborhoods in St. Cloud, neighborhoods in Minneapolis. And the way to find out where to put the signs is to go back to the deeds. I mean, there are plenty of people who are named in the book Slavery's Reach, who were the people involved in purchasing the land. So any deed from Harwood Iglehart, any deed from William Sprigg Hall, any deed from a guy from North Carolina named R.J. Mendenhall, who was the nephew of a major slaveholder in the Guilford County. So the paper trail is there, and there are all sorts of things that people can do to trace the path of slavery in Minnesota. Just have a couple of notes. Perhaps the biggest investor to Minnesota was a group of people from St. Louis, Missouri, the family of Pierre Choteau. They were the owners of American Fur, and American Fur established trading posts all throughout Minnesota during the fur trade of the 1830s and 1840s. And many people who would be considered to be Minnesota's founding fathers were employees of American Fur. Therefore, they were getting paid by these slaveholders out of St. Louis. So these would be, again, people like Henry Rice, Henry Sibley, Charles Borup, John Prince, who not only was a mayor of St. Paul, but was the founder of Princeton, Minnesota. So all you would have to do is just look at a roster of fur traders for American fur in Minnesota, and you'll find people who were paid by these St. Louis-based slaveholders. Now, the fur trade didn't last forever, and by the 1850s, Chattel and Company decided that instead of selling furs, they would start selling off the land where the trading posts were. But they kept some of their employees around. And one of them was Henry Sibley. In fact, Sibley, while he was still working for Chattel and Company, but selling their land instead, he just happened to become the first governor of Minnesota when Minnesota became a free state in 1858. Now, I should also say that 1858 is 14 months after the Dred Scott decision, which said that wherever an enslaver takes the captive, they don't have to free the captive in that territory. Now, it's not for states, but it is for territories. And it didn't matter if a territory was above the 3630 parallel or below, which had been the law with the Missouri Compromise back in 1820. But in 1857, the Dred Scott decision says there is no free territory or slave territory. It's all slave territory. And Minnesota wasn't a state yet. So slavery was legal in Minnesota for those 14 months. And there was an uptick in southern tourism that summer in 1857 because slaveholders felt more confident in spending their summer in Minnesota and knowing that nobody would try to take their slaves away. So when Minnesota becomes a free state the following year, then that puts all those people invested in tourism in a conundrum. Like, what can we do to not scare away slaveholders since slavery is illegal now? So they just decided not to enforce the law. And with Henry Sibley being paid by slaveholders right when the state is becoming a new state, he's not very keen on enforcing the law either. So there's this weird, I think, Minnesota nice kind of slavery that takes place where, well, yeah, so what happens from 1858 onward is that slaveholders bring one or two enslaved people with them for their vacations in Minnesota. And legally speaking, they're free, but nobody in Minnesota reaches out to tell the slaves they're free. And there is no legal mechanism that automatically allows slaves in Minnesota to claim their freedom. A book that I wrote that came out just this April is It Took Courage. It's about Eliza Winston. Now, Slavery's Reach is about someone who was caught up, Slavery's Reach is about the system of slavery in Minnesota, but It Took Courage is about someone who was caught up in the system in Minnesota, but who was able to get out of it. But the only way that she was able to get out of it was that she happened to meet a free African-American woman in Minneapolis who happened to know a network of anti-slavery activists, abolitionists. And they were able to convince a judge to issue a writ of habeas corpus for Eliza, which meant that the judge sent the sheriff of Hennepin County to where Eliza's enslavers were keeping her at a lake house over at Hastings. And the sheriff brought Eliza to a courtroom to meet that judge. And Eliza pleaded her case for her freedom. One of the free African-American woman's friends was a lawyer, so the lawyer advocated for her. And, well, the judge said, you're right. We're a free state here, so you are free. And that was in 1860. That was 2 years after Minnesota became a slave state. She was the first and only person to become free through the courts. And that's only because the Civil War broke out the following year, and Southerners stopped coming up here because they stayed in the South to defend their new country, the Confederacy. But slavery went kicking and screaming in Minneapolis. And I'll be here for the rest of the night to take any questions that people have about some of the things that I've been able to research and how my findings could somehow apply to the legislation that we're trying to get forward here. But thank you very much for your time.
All right, so is anybody hungry? So the food is ready. We're going to take a break, go eat, come back, and then we'll proceed with our programming in about 5-10 minutes.
I want to say real quick, because we're talking about who built Minnesota, the woman who opened us up with the great rendition, that one of the best renditions I ever heard of Lift Every Voice and Sing. Jamela Pettiford's great uncle, great grandfather is Bullard, and he was one of the builders, or the chief, our capital. So that history is right here in the room with us. And just for clarification, the great thing about the Minnesota Migration Act, it sets up a study, but it does come with immediate resources. Kind of like in Evanston, they said for the municipality, they set $10 million aside for cannabis funding. Then they did this, the study and the community engagement, and then that's when they started doing their housing program. Then they kept going. Then people were saying, well, what about direct cash payments? You know, my house was paid off. Like, I live in living assistance. We don't know, we want the money. So the Minnesota Migration Act is the perfect bill, and I encourage you guys to look at it. It's House File 2397, and when it's time for us to have a hearing about it, we'll need all of you guys to be there. We're honored to have all the way from Kansas City, Missouri. Dren Scott was in Missouri, enslaved, but in Missouri, I believe, was one of the last places to end slavery, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but we have the chair of the Kansas City Reparations Coalition. Kansas City is also moving forward with reparations, and so she's going to come and tell us about all the great work that they're doing and some of the other work that's happening here in the United States. Please give Janay Reliford a big round of applause.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Brother Trey. Thank you, Black Lives Matter Minnesota, for having me, and thank you to all of you all beautiful people that decided to be here this evening. Again, I'm Janay Reliford. I'm the chair of the KC Reparations Coalition. We started organizing in 2020. We were inspired by what we saw happening in Evanston, Illinois. The coalition is made up of several Black-led groups in Kansas City. So the National Black United Front Kansas City chapter is who put the invitation out to other Black-led groups. Sankofa for Kansas City is who I came by way of. We have Muhammad Smas 30, we have SCLC Kansas City, Urban Summit, and Urban League of Kansas City, who all make up the coalition. So we started out with working with our council people, and Councilwoman Melissa Robinson, she helped us champion a resolution in support of HR 40. So this was back in 2021. We were able to get that passed unanimously through our city council, which gave us we were inspired by that. So we said, well, let's go for the commission. So Councilwoman Melissa Robinson also assisted us in that. And in May of 2023, we got a 13-member commission seated. And so in May of 2024, we now have that commission funded. And they went live with their RFP to hire a researcher and a researcher and a project administrator to help with the harms reports. So we did get African American Redress Network and Howard University and Columbia University students to come to Kansas City. They've also done this work with some other municipalities, but they did a Black audit project with us. And so our harm areas are education, housing, health, public safety and economics. So they focused on those harms, and they came out with a really excellent report. So excellent in that I asked our commission, do we need more research, because it's really good. But the chair of the Kansas City Mayor's Commission on Reparations is Terry Barnes, and so she said that that Black Audit report will be the foundation of the work that the researcher that they're hiring would utilize to create these proposals. But we definitely have to have community support in that. So I'm just going to talk to you about reparations on the move, because reparations is moving. And we are at a historic moment for it right now. We should be very excited. So, Brother Jeremy, if you would go to the next slide. Okay, so reparations for what? This slide is something that Brother Siddiqui Kamal with Diving with a Purpose. If you've never heard of Diving with a Purpose, look them up. They actually dive for slave ships. So KC Reparations Coalition, we have meetings the last month, every month, that we have presenters come to educate us on, the history and current things that are going on in the reparations movement. So he utilized this photo, which was very impactful to all of us. You see the gentleman in the square, and he just points out that that man is a human being. He was a human being. He was a person. He had a family. He had loved ones. He had work to do. And the forces of colonialism plucked him out of that and he was pushed into forced labor. So, and that has impacted us for generations to come. So, reparations for what? That's what for. Next slide. The most egregious of crimes against humanity for which there is no statute of limitation. Remember that when people say, well, so long ago, no statute of limitation have been committed against those stolen from the motherland to be enslaved in America and their descendants. Next slide. So, what are reparations? Reparations is a process of repairing, healing, and restoring a people harmed because of their group identity, in violation of their fundamental human rights by government, corporations, institutions, and families. Those groups that have been injured have the right to obtain from the government, corporations, institutions, or families responsible for the injuries that which they need to repair and heal themselves. Reparations is more than a check. Truth-telling is a part of reparations, especially in our educational and political institutions. Land is a part of reparations. Tax relief is a part of reparations. Home and business ownership and free quality health care. All of these things can be reparations. Now, there are 5 pillars of reparations from the United Nations. The first is cessation, meaning stop the bleeding, stop the oppression, stop the racism. Restitution is restoring what was stolen. Compensation is a part of that. Rehabilitation and satisfaction, meaning we have those of us that have been harmed. We know we're the experts when it comes to what we need to overcome. So the satisfaction, nobody can tell us we're satisfied. That's for us to say. Next slide. Okay, what is not reparations? Regular public policy is not reparations. Reparations must be distinguished from regular or ordinary public policy, which is intended to address current or immediate issues, problems, and concerns. The allocation of resources to meet current needs of the Black community and the community at large, which is not exclusively for the Black community and controlled by the Black community, is standard, ordinary, regular policy. So on the other side of the slide, it just gives you a chronicle of what we've endured. Transatlantic trade slaves, 1619, 1865. Some people say it was before, way before 1619. Yeah. Yes. The Jim Crow, apartheid era, 1865 to 1965. And really, honestly, we're still in a Jim Crow era. You place the map, you know, over where the areas that were redlined, is the same. It's the same today. This is one era that we don't hear about. I haven't heard about enough in the reparations movement, and that's the crack era, the CIA Contra cocaine trafficking era. Not long ago at all. And the damages from that era we still live with today. I still have people in my family that are still addicted to crack cocaine. So, and then mass incarceration today. We're still dealing with that. Next slide. Relentless and historic fight for reparations. 1783 is the first documented incident that we know. Belinda Sutton, she sued her former enslaver and was awarded reparations. So she gave us the hope, an example that it's possible. If everybody pretty much heard 40 acres and a mule, that's what we were supposed to get from Field Order 15. It didn't happen, but here we are today still fighting. Callie House, she's known for creating a pension for African Americans that the government wasn't having that, so she ended up being arrested for fraud. But you know, more incidents of fighting. Queen Mother Moore, she's held in great esteem as a reparationist. In COBRA, the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America. HR 40, Congressman John Conyers. Yes. We love him for the tireless work that he did on our behalf, putting HR 40, you know, before legislators year after year after year until he just couldn't do it anymore. And then Sheila Jackson Lee picked up the mantle, and we know that we've lost her, but the fight continues. So her daughter actually petitioned to take up her baton. So I'm not even sure if that was awarded her, but the fight continues. Ta-Nehisi Coates, this article that he wrote in 2014 about reparations really got the movement kick-started again. We've been fighting, as I said, always. We've always been resisting. But that article that he wrote really put reparations back on the hearts and minds of people. And another organization, NARC, National African American Reparations Commission, these are organizations that's been in existence for a very long time, and they still stand. I already talked about Congressman Sheila Lee, Evanston, Illinois. Thank you, Evanston, Illinois, and Robin Ruth Simmons for her amazing work to make Evanston the first city in the nation to pass tax-funded reparations. Yes, that lets us know it's possible. And then 2023, we had Cori Bush, who did that companion legislation to HR 40. And that's when our Mayor's Commission on Reparations in Kansas City was seated. And there are reparations initiatives sprouting out all over the country. Reparations is on the move. Okay, next slide. Okay, so I would love for you all to be able to see, get a visual of this movement. So Brother Jeremy, I'm hoping you'll be able to click that link. Yeah, my computer is a little slow, so if anybody wants to hook a sister up with a sponsorship, laptop, holler at me after the presentation. If it doesn't come up, we won't worry about it, but go to First Repayers website and you see the links. Don't worry about it, Brother Jeremy.
Okay.
Where it says our story, firstrepair.org. Make a note of it. Check them out. Because First Repair is linking all of us
that are involved in this reparations movement. So that website has so many resources and information about what's going on around the nation regarding reparations. So reparations on the move, I put a bullet here about the Minnesota Migration Act and the permanent St. Paul, Minnesota Reparations Commission. That's big, y'all. It's permanent. Yes, reparations on the move, okay? Kansas City's Mayor Commission on Reparations is funded and moving forward to conduct research for repairing historical harms committed against Black residents. I told you our injury areas. And so this last bullet on here is about Restorative Actions, who is recently awarded KC Reparations Coalition funding, and we are so grateful for that. We are getting ready to embark on an education campaign to make sure that as many people as in Kansas City as we can to become familiar with reparations, because education is an issue with it still. So many people don't, especially in the Black community, still don't understand what reparations is. So Restorative Actions and Sacred Reckonings are Caucasian-led faith-based initiatives aimed at transferring wealth from those willing to surrender a portion of the ill-gained inheritance connected to the trade slave and legacy harms to descendants of the enslaved and indigenous communities. This is huge. This is huge because these are people that are saying we don't need the government to tell us what the right thing to do is. We know what the right thing to do is. So I'm very inspired and excited about those initiatives. Next slide. Okay, we're not gonna worry about you clicking that link, but I wanted everybody to make sure you engage with and encourage your state legislators to pass the Minnesota Migration Act. And yes, educate yourself on the history of chattel slavery, its legacy harms, and advocate for reparations. Now, in this work, especially dealing with politicians, people act like they scared to say reparations. And if you're not going to say reparations, we're not going to get reparations. Because remember, it's not ordinary policy. It's for a specific harm to a specific group of people. Focus on internal reparations. So what is internal reparations? That's our healing. That's something nobody can give us. That's something that we have to do for ourselves. And we need to be working on that at the same time as we're fighting for external reparations. So this internal reparations is including healing and restoration for our families. So much psychological damage because of the anti-Blackness that racism and oppression has caused in this country. We need to be focused on cooperative economics and no more infighting, because infighting is what is stalling our progress. So last slide, Brother Jeremy. Okay, so to connect with the KC Reparations Coalition, as I said, we have monthly meetings the last Monday of each month. They're virtual, so it's no reason why you can't join us 6 p.m. So you can email me at jreliford@kcreparationscoalition.com, or you can even go to the website kcreparationscoalition.com, and the link to the Zooms they're there. So you can join us via the link you find on our website, or email me and I will make sure that you get the links for our meetings. And I had this little thing for questions, but I don't know that there's time for questions, but I'm here. If anybody has questions for me, again, I'm so grateful to be with you this evening. And reparations now!